Good evening. Apologies, I have no Spanish, so bear with me, but thank you, Marta, for the introduction. Thank you all so much for coming, and thanks to my generous hosts at the Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza for the kind invitation to speak to you all this evening about Gabriele Munter, modern art, race and representation, and on the occasion of the museum's Gabriele Munter exhibition. It's a privilege to be here, thank you. In the opening to her sensitive and timely account, Listening to Images, published in 2017, Tina Kampt asks, how do we contend with images intended not to figure black subjects, but to delineate instead differential or degraded forms of personhood or subjection? Images produced with the purposes of tracking, cataloguing, and constraining the movement of black people in and out of diaspora. She unfolds a methodology from which her book takes its title, one of listening to images, in order to engage with lost histories and archives, attuning her senses to, quote, the quiet intensity and quotidian practices of refusal, and to, quote, the low hum of resistance and subversion. Whilst Kampt's analysis is specifically focused on the types of documentary photography characteristic of colonial archives, it also offers a useful point of entry into thinking about some of the negative spaces within art historical discourse. By negative spaces, I mean those voids within historiographies of modernism that have failed to think through what's at stake in the lost subjectivities of black people within modernist visual representation. How should we recover their absent presences? I don't think there's a straightforward or indeed singular answer to this question at all, especially given the fragmentary nature of the archives. But thinking through possibilities is what's at stake in a lot of my research, and in my recent thinking about some of the visual nuances in the work of Gabriele Munter that I'd like to share with you this evening. I want to begin tonight with a visual context for some of the decolonial thinking that has been preoccupying me in the lead up to giving this lecture to Spanish audiences, before focusing more specifically on the complexities of Munter's own position as a woman artist, working within the twin patriarchal structures of Imperial Germany and avant-garde modernism, in which, in Munter's own words, German male painters refused to believe that a woman could have real talent. Women's distinct contributions as artists, as in the case of the relationship between Munter and Kandinsky, were for many decades, more often than not, sidelined to the work and careers of their more famous male partners, as a side dish in Munter's terms. That's what she calls it. She says, we weren't only the side dish. The women were seen as only minor details within the prevailing grand masculinist narratives of modern art, which were in turn premised on colonial hierarchies that policed the boundaries between the so-called primitive and the modern. On a recent visit to the Spanish Pavilion at the 60th Venice Biennale last October to see the work of Spanish-Peruvian artist Sandra Gamarra Hechiki, I was extremely interested to see how, through her Pinacoteca Migrante, Hechiki probed Spain's colonial pasts through the medium of art and its histories. As a project, the Pinacoteca Migrante was designed by Hechiki to interrogate the perpetuity of colonial discourse within linear chronology of the West, as well as seeking forms of historical reparation. As the pavilion's curator, Agustin Perez Rubio, has commented of Hechiki's work, quote, her practice unveils the domestication of our Eurocentric colonial gaze, its structural racism and implicit machismo, while questioning our class privilege and access to so-called resources. It also reveals how historical and artistic hegemony has shaped models of representation, both in painting and later in photography, including the forms of classification and domestication of cultures based on programs and practices such as museology or the production of iconographic repertoires, among other modes of presentation and representation. And that was all from Rubio from his catalogue essay in the catalogue for the Spanish Pavilion. The body of work produced by Hechiki for the pavilion, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing her name wrong, consisted of more than 100 new paintings derived from original artworks that form the heritage of art collections and museums throughout Spain, including the Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza collection. Each new work by Hashiki sought to foreground a decolonial frame for looking at the original. It was in section 3, Miscegenation Masks, Portrait of Disappeared Heroes, where the Museo Thyssen Franz Hals original painting, Family Group in a Landscape of 1645 to 48, was reproduced in 2 different versions by Hashiki. The first version, on screen at the moment, was overlaid by Hashiki with choice extracts from Munter's partner, Vasily Kandinsky, and his colour theory concerning the spiritual in art, first published in 1912, in which explicit racist biases are brought to the fore. For example, in the first extract at the end, Kandinsky comments that, quote, "The artist who does not utilize his gift is like the slave who was worthless and lazy." In the second extract, the colour white is heralded as, quote, "not a dead silence, but one full of possibilities." Whilst in the third paragraph, the colour black is posited by Kandinsky as like an eternal silence without future or hope. It is the end of life. And to drive the point home, the final passage overlaid, the bottom one, is white is used to colour pure joy and infinite purity. Black is the robe of greatest, deepest sorrow and the symbol of death. Overlaid on top of Halsey's Family Group in a Landscape, the blindingly obvious omission of the young black boy in the canvas from the title of this portrait of an otherwise white family group is made painfully raw. In the original, this little servant or enslaved boy becomes almost invisible against the dark foliage behind him, in contrast to the whiteness of the family group. And I think that's made more so in the reproductions that Hashiki produces rather than in the original, actually, which I've just been upstairs to see. Research undertaken in the last few years by Velika Smulders at the Rijksmuseum and others has uncovered that the people shown in this group are likely to be the family of the general manager of Elmina Castle in Ghana during the same era in which the work was painted. Built by the Portuguese in 1482, Elmina Castle was a major holding fort for the transatlantic trade in enslaved African people off the west coast of Africa. The fort is now commonly referred to as the Door of No Return, after a passageway in the castle that led the kidnapped African people to either their death or a life of enslavement in Europe and the Americas. The little boy in Halsey's painting is thought to have been brought from Ghana to the Netherlands as a captured enslaved child. In Hashiki's double reworking of Halsey's painting, not only does she lay bare the mechanics of colonial racism in both Halsey's original and Kandinsky's modernist colour theories in her secondary working, she also signals a form of visual repair or reparation. She begins by changing the title of the work in a way that foregrounds the child, calling it instead Portrait of a Boy with Family in the Background. The boy now becomes the central visual focus of the new work, also in the way in which Hashiki has washed the whole of the canvas with the same red iron oxide, apart from very deliberately the boy's face and hands, which she brings into sharp visibility. The child's status as a migrant to a new land is also given contemporary salience through the inclusion of press clippings of contemporary migrants arriving from Africa to Europe, inserted into each of the corners of the canvas. So they're in the kind of bottom and the top corners. As Rubio has observed, the relationship between refuge and the idea of survival conveyed in the photographs is also suggested by the gold-coloured thermal rescue blanket, in turn overlaid with Ghanaian kente cloth, hanging like a curtain, bisecting the picture plane and erasing the white daughter. The cloth acts then as a symbol of an entire culture that this child brings with him, even though it was stolen from him by his forced transfer to Europe. Hashiki, of course, was not the first artist to have registered the active painterly erasure of the boy's presence in Frans Hals's painting. Titus Kafar's Shifting the Gaze was created live on stage as part of a dramatic finale to a TED talk he gave in 2017, where he decided to pick up a large paintbrush and obliterate the white figures in his copy of Frans Hals's family group in a landscape, thus only leaving the black child in the centre of the composition, visible, an active choice in redirecting the audience's gaze towards looking at the overlooked. Hashiki and Kafar are just two examples of contemporary artists for whom the act of looking again in order to undo and repair the colonial violence of the visual archive of art history is an imperative. But Hashiki's example is especially pertinent for my lecture tonight because of her direct invocation of Kandinsky's 1912 text. Concerning the spiritual in art, like so many other canonical modernist texts of this era, purporting avant-garde credentials, also reveals itself to be absolutely impregnated in the hierarchies of colonial racism that mark the era of its production. And so it's with this context in mind that I'd like to turn my consideration to the work of Gabriela Munter, as both an artist of her time, but also an artist with her own particular nuanced vision as well. I think her practice is quite complicated in relation to these kind of overriding contexts, and I'd like to explore that a bit more. In 2019, I was invited by the Royal Academy of Arts in London to curate an exhibition based on my ongoing research into aspects of German modernism. Having previously curated a show at the Lowry Gallery in Salford called Personal Feeling is the Main Thing, in which the works of British painter Chantal Joffe were placed in dialogue with works by Paula Modersohn-Becker, I knew that I wanted to focus my exhibition at the Royal Academy on the work of women artists working in Germany in the first few decades of the 20th century, and to open up an exploration of work by the quite distinct women, often popularly, though not always accurately associated with the term German Expressionism. I was keen to bring out the variety and nuance of their practice as artists on their own terms, and not in relation to the more often well-known or more dominant male artists in their circles. And so I'm really heartened by this solo exhibition, the Thyssen of Gabriela Munter on her own terms. And it is from this perspective that my interest and fascination with the work of Gabriela Munter continues. She was one of 7 women included in Making Modernism in an exhibition that explored various facets of modernism and modernity through the eyes of its women artists. The exhibition was divided into 5 broadly conceived themes: ourselves and others, the century of the child, sites of intimacy, a sense of place, and still lives. And so for today's lecture, I want to revisit some of these themes with a focus specifically on the artwork and photographs made by Munter across the long span of her career as an artist, who was born in 1877 in Imperial Germany, lived through 2 world wars, and who died relatively recently, just over 60 years ago, in 1962. So she lived in a really interesting times in Germany, and they, I think, inevitably play into some of her practice. What did it mean then for white women to practice as professional artists in Germany in the first few decades of the 20th century? How was their work shaped by their experiences of modernity, and what can we learn today by looking again at familiar themes of modernism through the lens of their historically determined, raced and gendered experiences? Having only become a unified country in 1871 after France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, Germany was a relative latecomer to nationhood and the attendant drives to exploit industrial and colonial labour for domestic gain, both at home and overseas. As one might expect of a new regime eager to make its mark, Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck did not languish in his efforts to promote the country's position on a world stage. Amongst the many devastating events that he orchestrated under the auspices of Kaiser Wilhelm I, the now infamous Berlin Conference of 1884 was one of the most damaging. Also known as the Scramble for Africa, the Congress of 13 European countries and representatives from the United States met in Berlin to carve up Africa for colonial domination and trade regulation. Territories across the continent were stolen from their inhabitants, and the indigenous population were forced into subjection by violent regimes ratified by European colonizing forces. Attempts at resistance were met with brutal repression. From 1904 until the outbreak of the First World War, the German occupation of Namibia led to the horrific genocide of tens of thousands of Herero and Nama people in concentration camps, the lived legacies of which are only just recently being openly confronted. For example, it was only in 2020 that the Swakopmund concentration camp memorial in Namibia received this new tombstone, this image on the right, that more directly acknowledges the German army's responsibility in the genocide of the Herero and Nama people, and kind of conversations with the German government and representatives of Herero still continue to this day. It's a very recent and raw history. Germany's jostling for position on the colonial stage was equally underscored at home through regular Völkerschauen, or ethnographic exhibitions, in which people of colour from the colonies were transported to Germany to be put on display for the entertainment of predominantly white European visitors. The most prodigious purveyor of so-called human zoos, or Völkerschauen, in turn-of-the-century Germany, was the Hamburg-based Karl Hagenbeck, who lived from 1844 and died in 1913. But his legacy lived on after his death. Hagenbeck procured and sold exotic animals to newly emerging zoos and circuses across the globe, as well as exhibiting people from Africa, Asia, and the Americas in his enormously popular mass entertainments, the so-called Völkerschauen, or human zoos, put on for consumption by a white colonial gaze. These colonial spectacles were big business for Hagenbeck, who also produced and sold tourist postcards such as these of the troops, and in which recent years have provided the cause of much uncomfortable reflection about the ethics of digital archival practices that continue to make historical images of such violent practices freely available and widely circulated online. A further aspect of this ongoing archival violence is also the knowledge that the people in these photographs were subject to a variety of invasive scientific inquiries. In 1904, by which time Germany had proudly been the third largest colonial power after Britain and France, Dr. H.C. Stratz published his scientifically racist text Naturgeschichte des Menschen, Grundriss der somatischen Anthropologie. The proudly announced, so it's a natural history of people, foundations for a somatic anthropology. The proudly announced 342 colour images included in the book were in fact, as Katharina von Hammerstein notes, mainly of photographs of naked human beings from around the globe who were measured, classified and compared in terms of where they sat on an evolutionary scale of supposed primitive savagery. Source material, i.e. the people, photographed, measured and classified for Stratz's book and other texts like it, were in part sourced from ethnographic displays like Hagenbeck's. Performers' body measurements were recorded and compared. The colour of their skin and the texture of their hair were determined according to elaborately racist categories in which whiteness was privileged as the highest form of human development. Germany's art and artists did not remain immune to such dehumanizing ethnographic displays, and amongst the many extant examples of Gabriele Munter's early photographs are 6 that she took at the Munich Oktoberfest in 1901. These 6 on the screen at the moment. From some preliminary visual research I've undertaken, it's highly likely that Munter's 6 photographs, taken with her portable Kodak camera, were likely taken during her visit to Karl Hagenbeck's Malabar and Völkerschau, which toured across Europe from at least 1900 through to 1902. As a mass tourist attraction, Hagenbeck's Human Zoo toured from his base in Hamburg to venues in Germany and Europe, including Dresden, Amsterdam and Paris, and in October 1901 to Munich during the city's annual Oktoberfest. And there's a kind of tradition of Munter photographing festivals, both in America and obviously the Oktoberfest here. It was of interest to her. We can map Munter's photographs against historic ethnographic photographs and postcards of Hagenbeck's show, of the same or similar individuals, via their identical dress, especially, but also potentially via some similarities in physical appearance. Although with vintage images, it's often visually quite difficult to kind of map them exactly, to say it with any great certainty. So I've been looking kind of quite at small images on the screen, so it's quite good to see them quite big here. What seems fairly certain is that the Orientalist backdrop of the fake temple structure, which seems to be based on an actual temple in Colombo, formerly Sri Lanka, is the same in both Munter's photographs and the tourist postcards and extant photographs of Hagenbeck's Malabar and Folka show. So you can see these women in front of the temple here, and then you can see the temple there, and it's pretty much the same structure. And there's another one as well. This is Munter's photograph of the temple structure, and you can see the front door and the sort of ground floor is the same architecture as the backdrop for this troupe behind. Looking closely at Munter's photographs today, especially in relation to their indexical links to images of the same group of people captured by the colonial gaze of the Hagenbeck archives, what remains interesting to me seems to be the ways in which, despite the dehumanizing occasion of their photographic capture, the often female protagonists photographed by Munter retain a certain reticent defiance, what Tina Kampt has referred to as the quiet hum of refusal. Unlike the many propagandist posters and official images of ethnological exhibitions of the era, which often deployed scopic conventions designed to evoke associations of criminality in their sitters via the use of full frontal or side profiles of the indigenous people portrayed, Munter's colonial subjects, although hesitant in their exposure to the imperial gazes of the various white women behind, to the side, and in front of them, remain composed and diffident. She photographs them as somehow undefeated by the indignities visited upon their perceived subaltern differences. And I think this is where Munter's complexity as a visual practitioner comes through, as we'll see in a moment with some of her photographs taken whilst in Tunisia with Kandinsky. Whilst as a white imperial German woman, Munter is inevitably caught up in the colonial matrices of privilege and power that her status as a European woman affords her, she retains an interest in and a fascination for human beings, and other women in particular. Her photographs, and indeed some of her most well-known and well-loved paintings, and I just brought one of my particular favourites, which is in the show, the wonderfully wry Kandinsky and Erma Bossi at the table, where Kandinsky seems to be mansplaining to Erma Bossi, and she has this kind of blank look, which I always enjoy. I think the photographs in her paintings reveal both a critical eye and a humanist's empathy for other women trapped within an uneven patriarchal society. Of course, whilst the power dynamics within her 6 extant photographs of Hagenbeck's Malabar troupe, taken on her visit to the Munich Oktoberfest in 1901, are of a completely different register from a painting such as Kandinsky and Erma Bossi at the table, they nevertheless reveal an interesting set of complex racial and gendered dynamics at play, of which Munter was a keen and often wry observer. In many ways, Munter's images of women on display at the Munich Volksschau recall a similar sensibility to some of the photographs she took in America on a trip with her sister in 1898 to see relatives after their mother had died. 3 women in their Sunday best, Marshall, Texas, from 1899 to 1900, for example, conveys a similar quality of anthropological inquiry and gaze. The women are beautifully dressed, and we could surmise from what may be prayer books they carry, they may be on their way to or from church, although other research is showing that they may be at the Juneteenth festivals, but it's kind of slightly unsure what the context for this photograph is. Either way, despite the elegance of their display, They're also circumscribed by the seemingly mocking and hostile glances of the white children to their left, our right, and the white woman in the carriage on the road slightly behind them. Munter's own account of her family's position regarding racial difference in America is perhaps significant in this context. In an interview conducted by Edward Roditi in 1960, Munter recounts the early life of her father, who had left Germany for America in 1848 after getting into trouble for his pro-democracy political views. It was in the States where he met Munter's mother, also German. They married and remained in America for as long as possible. But as Munter recalls, quote, during the Civil War, they found business increasingly difficult in the southern states, where they had settled. As traders, the German immigrants were not committed to the plantation economy. Most of them, besides, had come to the States as political refugees and believers in the rights of man. They were often suspected by their neighbours of sympathising with the northern abolitionists. So my father decided in 1864 to bring his family back to Europe, where he settled in Berlin. I was born there in 1877 as the youngest of his children. As an artist thoroughly of her time, Munter is, as we've seen, inevitably structured in a privileged position in relation to both the indigenous women in Munich and the black women in Texas whom she photographs. Yet despite their objectification as exoticized others, particularly in the context of the white onlookers captured in both sets of photographs, Munter's visual sensibility is also able to very often catch the humanity of her sitters under their strained circumstances. On their arrival in 1898, Munter and her sister stayed in the USA for 2 years, visiting various relatives, disembarking in New York with stops in Missouri and Arkansas before arriving in Texas, visiting their cousin, Willie Graham, before retracing their steps and boarding the ocean liner Pennsylvania back to Germany in October 1900. As already indicated, the occasion of their visit to the States had been the loss of their mother 1 year earlier. The sisters, both single, were orphaned. Their father had died some time before. But they were also both newly independently wealthy as a result. And whilst a tragic context, such early economic independence was to prove central to Munter's ability to move freely and to pursue her interest in becoming an artist. She'd already attended private drawing classes in Dusseldorf prior to her trip to the USA, but it's the 400 photographs she made during the trip, using her Kodak Bullseye No. 2 camera, a gift from a relative, that are the most powerful early testament to her burgeoning visual skills. One of the compositional themes amongst the many striking varieties of image that Munter captured on her US trip is one in which people, relatives and strangers alike, are photographed outside in settings indicative of their immediate lived environments: wooden houses, shops, shacks, sheds, fields, horses, carts, donkeys, meadows, orchards, rivers and lakes. And these are just 2 small examples of that kind of artistic vision that is set quite early on through her photography, I think. A focus on the intimate, the everyday, and the ordinary is made special, as testified in these 2 examples, through Munter's ability to compose stills from amidst quotidian details of daily existence, a skill she carried over into her subsequent paintings, made with both the Phalanx and the Blauer Reiter groups in Germany. Apologies that this photograph, which looked fine on my screen, is a bit blurred. In April 1901, 6 months after her return to Germany and 6 months before the arrival of Hagenbeck's Malerbar Trupper for Oktoberfest, during an era when women's access to academic art and training was limited to private schools rather than state academies, Munter moved to Munich, settling in an artistically lively area of Schwabing, in order to enroll in the Künstlerinnenverein, the Association of Women Artists. In December that year, she attended an exhibition of the Phalanx group, and impressed by the work of sculptor Wilhelm Hüsgen, she enrolled in his sculpture class at the Associated Phalanx Art School. Her registration also included life drawing and painting classes taught by Phalanx co-founder Vasily Kandinsky. By spring 1902, Munter had transferred entirely to Kandinsky's painting class. In summer 1902, Kandinsky led the class, including Munter, on a painting expedition to Kochel, a small village in the foothills of the Alps, where they would set up their easel outdoors to capture the Bavarian landscape in paint. It's here where their relationship blossomed, although since Kandinsky was still married to his cousin Anya Chimakin, Munter tried to keep her distance. According to Annegret Hoberg, it was only after some hesitation that Munter once more joined Kandinsky's residential Phalanx class painting trip in summer 1903, this time to Kalmunz in eastern Bavaria. It was here that the couple became illicitly engaged, despite Kandinsky's existing marriage. The economically privileged nomadic lifestyle that they subsequently shared from 1904 to 1908 was clearly born from their sense of discomfort about their illegitimate engagement. Indeed, in a letter from Kandinsky to Munter, written on August the 14th, 1904, after they had returned from their first extended trip to Holland and Munter had been to see family in Bonn, Kandinsky ruminates on their nomadic lifestyle that, quote, their pre-legitimate state of affairs is least felt when travelling. He continues with a sense of indignation and resolution. Quote, not living together until I'm free? Why? What for? To what end? For the world? As long as we're not spouses recognised by the state, we shall live outside the world. It's very determined. So armed with the enthusiasm of new love, the couple travelled across Europe to North Africa by train, coach and one-horse carriage, by steamboat along the Rhine and by ship across the Mediterranean, as tourists, opening up their visual repertoire to new possibilities provided by the many different terrains encountered along the way. As Louisa Henn has observed, although tensions within European nations and political alliances played a role in private conversations when, for example, Kandinsky expressed allegiance to his Russian origins, they did not seem to have significant or negative influence on travel opportunities. Kandinsky and Munter were able to move freely between Kalmunz and Carthage through Austria-Hungary and the Kingdom of Italy, with which the German Empire had been contractually linked through the Triple Alliance since 1882, and to France and to its annexed territories, which opened up corresponding opportunities through the Triple Entente with Russia and Great Britain. The destinations they selected for their stays, some of which lasted several months, corresponded to the usual tourist destinations of the time. What's interesting is that despite Kandinsky's declared allegiance to his Russian origins in the era of cultural nationalism in Germany, Munter and her partner deliberately sought out and indeed found much longed for freedom, for a time at least, in an insouciant colonial lifestyle that took them across Europe into North Africa. In a letter dated November 12, 1904, Kandinsky wrote to Munter suggesting that they should, quote, travel to Marseille and then to Africa with a steamer, spend winter there and spring in Spain and France. Summer could be in Sweden. He also asks, if possible, can you get hold of a Baedeker for North Africa? Tunis, Tangier, I don't know how to spell the wretched things properly, but you know what I mean. And perhaps Egypt. If there's no Baedeker for the first two, then we'll buy something in French. Whilst Annegret Hoberg notes that there's no obvious reason as to why they chose Tunisia, it was most likely pragmatic. Since the country's transformation into a so-called French protectorate in 1881, occupied by French colonial troops for its own protection, the country offered the European traveller, enmeshed in the values of a colonial political system, a safely contained exoticism, replete with a familiar European infrastructure and all of the attendant comforts that a European colonist might expect. As Hoberg observes, Kandinsky and Munter travelled well-worn tourist trails through Tunisia with their travel guide in their hand. So it was, on the 6th of October 1904, Munter and Kandinsky travelled from Germany to Tunisia via France. They set sail from Marseille on the passenger ship Ville de Tunis, arriving in the northern port city of Bizerte, where they stayed over Christmas Eve. As Louisa Henn has noted, they lived in Tunis from Christmas Day 1904 until early April 1905, initially at the Hotel Saint-Georges and then at the Hotel Suisse, also making trips to the nearby cities of Carthage, Zeus, and Kairouan. Although they spent almost 3 months there, they remained at a distance from the local population, explicitly at Kandinsky's behest. As Munter noted in her diary of 1905, quote, "Our sketchbooks and studies, as well as the paintings and photographs, convey the detail of our Tunisian impressions. At times we got along well, at times not at all. We took walks in the city and also in the Belvedere Park. It was never boring with my beloved, but we didn't make contact with any other people. He never wanted it." As Annegret Hoberg has also commented of their location in the city, between this district, built by the French to accommodate their own infrastructure, and the Medina, there was not only a wasteland, but also a profound ideological and social abyss. Yet it's evident that the country, whose appearance was perceived as alien, also made a deep impression on them. This is borne out by the nearly 180 photographs that Munter took during their stay, the second largest number of photographs in her oeuvre, after the 400 or so she took during her 1898 trip to America. As Emily Christensen's remarked, these photographs capture how Munter saw the world as she found it in Tunisia and reveal the choices she made in deciding how to convey that vision. Many of them demonstrate her interest in depicting the simplified, abstracted essence of a scene that are comparable to the approach that she also took in her American photographs of landscapes, houses, farm animals, and children, yet with the added complexity that Orientalist stereotypes invariably arise from the photographs taken of the other, from the safe distance of the colonial tourist. For example, in the two images on screen at the moment, Munter elegantly frames a view of the Orient that mirrors the iconographic conventions common to both tourist postcards and the immensely popular late 19th century academic genre painting of Orientalism. Picturesque archways with cobbled streets, cast in sharply contrasting light and shadow, draped figures carrying woven baskets on their heads, all consciously de-individualized and deliberately kept at a scopic distance for full visual effect. This is not to say that all of Munter's photographs of Tunisia fall into this trap, although many of them do. As Nadine Noor El-Din has observed, most of the photographs taken in Tunis document dynamic crowds of people, women, children, elegant black figures, riders, architecture in Tunisia, scenes of nature and bustling marketplaces. Looking at these two works side by side is quite an instructive way of thinking about the choice Munter makes in her photographs during this particular trip. And they seem to reveal two sides of the same coin, a deep fascination with and interest in people, especially though not exclusively mothers and children. Seen as a pair, they seem to stage a particularly interesting gender dynamics of looking. The mothers and children on the pavement connecting with each other, but not with Munter, seemingly totally oblivious to her, and many of them with their backs turned away from her, on the one hand. And on the other, an extremely striking photograph of 3 elegantly dressed black Maghrabian men wearing bright white capes, finely polished leather shoes, and regal felt chechiyas, the hats they're wearing, who meet our gaze head on and stand their ground. Clearly curious of the spectacle of Munter with her camera in front of them, in stark contrast, however, to the figures sitting on the ground behind them. Their focused look back at Munter recalls Edward Said's observations in his 1986 essay, Double Vision, that, quote, "We too are looking, we too are scrutinizing, assessing, judging. We're more than someone's object. We do more than stand passively in front of whoever, for whatever reason, has wanted to look at us." In both images, distance is maintained and recalls Munter's somewhat wistful recollection of Kandinsky's lack of desire to, quote, "make contact." One can only speculate that were Munter travelling instead with her sister, as in their trip to America, would this close but distant visual relationship with photographic subjects in Tunisia have taken a different form? Or were the colonial hierarchies of racial separation always going to determine it? This is not a question we can ever know the answer to, of course, but it's an interesting one to grapple with in this context nevertheless. Looking and being looked at, suspicious of the Kodak girl, or completely oblivious. These are some of the binaries staged through Munter's photographs of the indigenous inhabitants of Tunisia during the winter and spring of 1905. In her evocative essay, Impressions of Tunis, art historian Nadine El Nordin speculates about the now lost to us identities of Munter's subjects. She asks, who are these people and what are they doing? Where are they going? And what are the multisensory experience of this market? What does it sound like? The voices of its merchants and visitors. What does it smell like? The fragrance of spices and food. What does it taste like? What are its colours? As Din observes, we are too far removed from the scene to fully grasp the experience. And yet Munter too, whilst documenting her impressions for the record, is clearly set apart from her inquisitive subjects, the object of their scrutiny and suspicion, both a tourist and a representative of the colonial oppressor, an uninvited guest in their land. By 1904, Tunis and its suburbs were home to around 55,000 foreigners, Italians, French, Maltese, and others, alongside the city's 80,000 Muslims and 39,000 Jewish people. Yet most of the time, Munter's Tunisian photographs deliberately obfuscate any evidence of this, seeking instead, as already indicated, to replicate familiar Orientalist tropes of the tourist postcard, such as the two figures with a donkey on screen at the moment on your left. There are, however, exceptions to this rule, perhaps evident in images like the elegant three men in front of the grocery store in Bab Souika, which perhaps seem to reach towards some effort in individualizing the men, despite the fact that we have no record of who they were or what their names were. And perhaps also this street scene with women in Arab clothing and men in European clothing, taken in the winter of 1905, in which hints of different cultural backgrounds emerge, pointing to the multi-ethnic environment of Tunis. In both of these visually arresting photographs, we're able to contemplate the expressions on their faces and consider what they might reveal, if anything, about their inner lives. Whilst none of them are individuated by their names or any information that might give us insight into who they were and what their daily lives were like, we are perhaps offered by Munter, through these close-up images of other people, an opportunity for empathy. For most of my lecture this evening, I focused in some detail on the ways in which Munter used her skills as a photographer to capture aspects of the colonial modern in Imperial Germany, abolitionist America, and French-governed Tunisia, during an era steeped in ideologies of racial hierarchy and subjugation of the other. Yet I hope what I've also shown is how Munter's personal vision was one that also left room for nuance and speculation in her approach to humanity. Whilst her artistic vision was undoubtedly influenced by the broader cultural values of her era, she nevertheless made room for her own sensibilities to come to the fore. The complexities evident in Munter's photographic approach to non-European people can also be teased out in some of her paintings, and it's with a consideration of one of these in particular that I'd like to conclude my lecture this evening. This is Munter's portrait of a woman of 1930. Its title is a recent title that I taught. So when I showed this work at the Royal Academy show in London, it belongs to a private collection in Austria. And it had an anachronistic title, so we worked with the family to talk to them and think about ways in which we could exhibit it with a new title. And they were very receptive to that idea. And so, certainly for our show, it was just known as Portrait of a Woman. And it went alongside in our show with other images of anonymous sitters by Munter and Mortison Becker and others. So it had the same register in our show as the other paintings as well, which was important to me. For most of my lecture this evening, I focused... I've said that. During the course of my research into works by Munter for Making Modernism at the Royal Academy in 2022, I came across this painting by Munter held in a private collection in Austria, painted by her in 1930, and which, written on the back in her handwriting, it states Paris, 1930, signalling where and when the work was painted. It was subsequently given by Munter to her niece, Amy Schroeter, some of whose works are in the show upstairs, who had seen it in Munter's studio and expressed a liking for it. And it's remained in her family ever since, so in the descendants. According to anecdotes from the family, Munter had apparently seen the sitter on the tram in Paris and decided to paint her. We know very little about the production of the work and whether Munter sketched her on the tram and then recreated the painting from memory back in her studio, whether she took a photograph of her, or whether other circumstances prevailed. What we do know is that by 1930, paintings and photographs of black Europeans in Germany and France post the First World War were increasingly prevalent, and they begin to operate on a different register from the Völkerschauen images as well. They begin to register in terms of citizens of these cities, of these major cities. The Völkerschauen images and the Völkerschauen themselves still occurred and still circulated, but there was now this kind of complexity with more and more, increasingly more black Europeans in different European countries at this time, which is quite interesting and quite underexplored, I think, in research. Popular mass entertainment shows like Josephine Baker's La Revue Negre and those of the entertainment troupe self-styled as the Chocolate Kiddies, so they kind of self-style themselves into a sort of stereotype, really, also played up to Weimar audiences' nostalgia for their lost colonial pasts. Germany had lost all its colonies in the Treaty of Versailles in 1918, which they were very bitter about, obviously, along with lots of other things. So they played up to Weimar audiences' nostalgia for their lost colonial pasts in dialogue with their enthusiastic embrace of American jazz culture. Baker, in particular, was a mass media sensation and the subject of numerous visual representations in all media. Yet she was also an exception in her carefully crafted visual presence as a deliberately staged exotic outsider, originally from the USA via France, and performing Africa in a post-colonial Germany, nostalgic for its lost colonies. Baker's fame, socioeconomic status, and performativity enabled her to come and go within the country as she pleased, as someone popularly celebrated and desired. Her situation and that of her African-American peers, including the Chocolate Kiddies and Duke Ellington, all of whom found huge success in Weimar Germany, differed markedly from that of the numerous African, Indian, and Roma protagonists of Weimar visual culture, who were far less mobile, economically impoverished, and within visual representations of the era, often anonymous. They were to be found more readily still in the margins of the leisure industry, the circus, the freak show, the Völkerschau, the insalubrious nightclub, and as one amongst many anonymous extras on the sets of the era's booming film industry. The concept of who or what others, like the subject of Munter's painting, might mean and how they signified in the context of Weimar visual culture was contingent upon a spectrum of potential attitudes in relation to dominant norms and political inflections. The aesthetic of new objectivity registered a variety of subject positions at play in figuring difference. Otherness was located in the race, gender, able-bodiedness, and sexual preferences of the subjects represented, but also in the materiality of the object as artworks and in the regional inflections of their content. When we know very little about works like this, it behoves art historians like myself to continue to attend to the shifting contexts in which difference is visually figured, in order to produce a fuller picture of German modernism that decenters whiteness and, as Sandra Gamara-Heshiki suggests, rebel against inertia. Thank you. I did have like a bit more extemporizing, which was in my show in the Royal Academy. I showed this work alongside shopping, after shopping, because of the kind of tram connection between the two, and the fact that actually, you know, in the still life on the tram after shopping, you know, we don't know who the woman is, we don't know who the figure is, we just have the gloves and the shopping. So I kind of, you know, what Sadiya Hartman would call a critical fabulation, I put them together to sort of produce a potential narrative for the other woman on the tram. And I was also interested in the fact that at the same time that Munter was, or just a few years before Munter was painting her woman, of course the Harlem Renaissance was active. And people like Laura Wheeler-Waring were producing completely other register of portraits of black women. And I think there's so much work to be done, so much research to be done about thinking about all these different painterly contexts within art history. But that's where I will leave it. Thank you.